The earth is not as quiet as we pretend it to be. That is the thought that has followed me like a stray dog all these years, padding just out of sight in the corridors of my mind, too persistent to ignore and too inconvenient to welcome. Tonight it sits with me in a stone room that once belonged to a monk whose name no one remembers, while a single trembling flame gnaws at a short wick and paints the ceiling with unsteady shadows. Outside, beyond the monastery walls, the world murmurs its usual chorus of traffic, sirens, engines, and distant, careless laughter. Inside, there is only the soft rasp of paper under my fingers and the slow, measured drum of my own heart as I turn once more to the folio that started all of this. If you have found these words, my friend, then you have joined me in this dim cell for a little while. I want to greet you properly before the strangeness begins. Stay with me. Listen carefully. And if what you hear stirs something in you, do not let it vanish into the noise of your day. Share it. Speak about it. On whatever platform you use to consume these confessions, I ask you to subscribe, to leave your thoughts, to press that small sign of approval. People now call alike, not for my sake, but so this warning is not buried as quietly as the folio almost was. Let the algorithm, that new, invisible providence of our age, carry this tremor a little further than my voice could travel alone. I am a man who has spent too many nights in archives and too many mornings doubting what he read. I have walked between scripture and shadow, as I often say to myself, with no one to correct me when the metaphors become melodramatic. My back has memorized the shape of wooden chairs in reading rooms. My eyes know the color of dust that gathers on shelves no one has touched in centuries. I am not the sort of person who hears voices, sees omens in clouds, or feels great cosmic destinies pressing on his shoulders. I came here for footnotes and marginalia, for the faint fingerprints of forgotten theologians, not for visions. And yet the vision has arrived anyway, not as a blaze of light in the sky, but as ink on a fragile page, words written by a hand that trembled enough to leave small, wavering lines at the ends of letters. The folio lay in a box without a label, between a crumbling missal and a ledger of grain deliveries no one needs to remember. Its parchment is thin, almost translucent, and when I hold it up, the candlelight swims through it as if it were skin stretched over bone. At the top of the first page there is no title, no author's name, only a small drawing. 3 circles of different sizes, intersecting in such a way that they form a crooked, off-balance pattern, like a cluster of planets held in a clumsy hand. Around the circles a few lines radiate outward, not quite straight, as though whoever drew them had been in a hurry or deeply unsettled. That little sketch has unsettled me more than it should. I cannot explain why. Perhaps because it looks less like a symbol and more like someone trying to remember the shape of something they saw only once, and in terror. The text beneath the drawing is written in Latin that tastes of the late medieval period. But there are turns of phrase that feel older, as if the scribe were copying from a still more ancient tongue. It begins without preamble. The world cannot hold still when covenant is broken, for the earth is not a stone but a living recorder of oaths. When I first translated that line, I almost laughed. It sounded like the sort of mystical exaggeration a zealous preacher might use to frighten peasants before the harvest. But then again, the folio was never meant for peasants. It was hidden among documents reserved for councils and committees, for men who weighed every syllable as if it were gold dust. That is what bothered me. The seriousness of its hiding place. The prophecy that coils through these pages is simple enough to summarize and impossible to accept outright. It claims that the planet itself, the ground beneath our houses, the seas nudging our coasts, the air gliding over our roofs, is not an indifferent stage for human drama, but a restless partner in an ancient agreement. When human beings live in alignment with that agreement, the manuscript says, the world finds a kind of deep equilibrium, a Sabbath rest woven into its seasons. But when the agreement is betrayed too many times, When violence and injustice are multiplied without repentance, the world grows agitated. Its crust shifts, its winds reconfigure, its waters climb into places they were never meant to cross. It begins to tremble like an animal whose body remembers every wound. I will confess something to you. Since you have been kind enough to listen this far, I do not know if I believe any of this. I have spent most of my life in the company of facts that can be footnoted and claims that can be cross-checked. The idea that the earth can be restless in a moral sense, that it can be broken not by tectonic collisions but by cruelty and greed, seems at first blush like poetic nonsense. Yet the folio refuses to stay in the realm of vague spiritual metaphor. It is disturbingly precise in some places, describing storms that move like accusations, seas that refuse to recede after swallowing unjust cities, and skies that grow discolored not only by smoke, but by what it calls the heaviness of unconfessed blood. There is a particular line, midway down the page, that has become a splinter in my thoughts. When the weight of broken promises reaches the measure that only the Maker knows, it says, "The planet will no longer hold its pose of calm. Its axis will shiver, its rhythm will become uneven, and men will say that nature has lost its mind, not knowing that it is they who have driven it mad." The scribe underlined that sentence with a faint stroke, as though fearing that future readers might skim past it. To the right of it, in the margin, there is a tiny smudge of reddish ink, like a fingerprint dragged sideways. It looks, under the magnifying glass, oddly like a spiral, a small cyclone of color. I have caught myself staring at that spiral as if it might start to move. If this were a simple curiosity, a relic of medieval fear, I would catalog it, mention it in a paper, and move on. But the folio is not a single frantic page. It is a slow, deliberate construction. It quotes scripture with an intimacy that suggests the writer lived and breathed in a world where those verses were as common as rain. It alludes to apocryphal hymns I recognize from other obscure collections, songs in which mountains are described as listening and rivers as bearing witness. It uses phrases that echo a certain minor prophet who spoke of the land mourning because of the people who dwelt upon it. The scribe threads these texts together without forcing them, like beads on an unseen string, until one cannot help but see a pattern. The pattern, if I am honest, frightens me. It suggests that what we call natural disaster might sometimes be a kind of speech, that earthquakes could be paragraphs and floods could be exclamation marks, that droughts might be long ellipses where the world is withholding its generosity in a kind of silent protest. If that were true, then every time we shake our heads at shattered towns or freak storms, we might be witnessing not random harm, but a tired planet raising its voice in the only language it has. This is the part where my rational mind pulls back sharply, like a horse scenting fire. It insists that I am committing the oldest human error, seeing meaning in meaningless noise. I sit here, debating with myself, while the flame guttering in front of me seems to nod with every draft slipping under the ancient door. My shadow, stretched and bent across the wall, looks taller than I am, as if another version of me were standing there, one who has already decided to believe. The real me, the smaller, flesh-bound me, clings to skepticism. I remind myself that medieval writers loved to personify the earth, that their cosmologies were full of living winds and sentient stars. I tell myself this is nothing more than a relic of their worldview. But there is a heaviness in the room tonight that does not feel entirely psychological. It feels like a hand resting gently on the back of my neck. You may ask why I do not simply dismiss it, why I allow a handful of old sentences to invade my sleep and demand your attention as well. The answer is embarrassingly simple. While I was translating the folio, the news feeds on my phone were full of images that looked like illustrations for the text. Coastlines eaten away more quickly than models predicted. Forests burning not in the expected seasons but in strange, early rages. Storms that drifted in impossible paths. circling the same battered regions as if unwilling to move on. On the morning I first read the line about the planet's axis shivering, a minor report appeared about an infinitesimal change in the length of the day, the sort of thing physicists attribute to shifting masses of ice and water. I know the explanations. I respect them. And yet, seeing those graphs and reading these words side by side felt like watching two separate languages describe the same argument in different alphabets. There is another detail I have not mentioned. Since I began working with the folio, I have heard, at odd hours, a low sound. I do not mean in some mystical inner ear. I mean in the stone of this place. It is not the wind, though it sometimes rides beneath the wind. It is not the distant traffic, though it sometimes hides under that as well. It is a hum so deep that it is almost more vibration than sound. The monks who remain here, a dwindling handful of old men with kind faces and tired eyes, tell me the building has always had its noises. They say the stone shifts a little in the cold. Pipes sigh. Wood responds to temperature. They are not wrong. But there are moments when I stand barefoot on the floor and feel something like a heartbeat, slow and irregular, as if the world itself were remembering to breathe. I am aware how this sounds. If I were listening to myself from the outside, I would raise an eyebrow too. Perhaps you already are. Perhaps you are seconds away from closing this, from letting my doubts slide back into the dark where they can trouble no one. Before you do, allow me to say this. I am not asking you to believe a doctrine. I am telling you how one frail human mind is wrestling with a text that feels older than the ink that carries it. I am telling you that when I read its lines about a restless and broken planet, something in my chest tightens, not with superstition, but with recognition, as though I have been trying for years to ignore a conversation happening just beneath the surface of things. The folio speaks of a first fracture, a moment when humanity began to treat the earth not as a home shared with other creatures, but as an inert warehouse of resources, a silent thing to be carved up and measured and sold. It never names this moment in historical terms, which is both frustrating and strangely wise. It does not say whether it was when the first forest was felled without thanks, or the first river was redirected to feed an empire, or the first mountain was gouged open for the metals in its bones. It simply says, when man ceased to bless the ground and began to price it, the restlessness began. A poetic line, yes, but also a diagnosis that sounds uncomfortably plausible when I look at maps of mines and oil fields and the scars they leave. What troubles me most is the way the manuscript refuses to let me keep the subject at a safe, planetary distance. Toward the end of the first page, it shifts from global language to intimate language, almost like a preacher lowering his voice. Each heart, it says, is a small earth with its own weather and quakes. When a person lives in constant deceit, the text suggests, the inner ground shifts beneath them, making their steps unsure. When they reconcile, confess, and repair, the ground firms. It is as though the writer is whispering that the macrocosm and the microcosm are reflections of one another. If our inner landscapes are perpetually restless and broken, how could the larger one not mirror that turmoil sooner or later? I close my eyes sometimes and imagine the world as described here, not a ball of rock spinning indifferently through a meaningless void, but a kind of vast, wounded animal whose nerves run through oceans and forests and fault lines. I imagine how it must feel, if feelings can be attributed to such a thing, to have your skin scraped and punctured, your lungs thickened with smoke, your veins poisoned, your equilibrium mocked by beings who stand upon you and declare you dead matter. It is, of course, only an image, a story. But then I think of how we already speak, without irony, of the earth's crust, its mantle, its molten heart. We borrow the language of bodies to talk about our planet's structure, while insisting that bodies are the only things that feel. The folio simply pushes that metaphor out to its unsettling conclusion. I am not ready to say, in clear daylight, that I believe this prophecy. yet I am no longer able to say that I do not. I exist in a narrow corridor between those positions, lit by a single, flickering candle that smells of beeswax and age. In this corridor, every creak of wood, every shift in the wind outside, every small tremor in the soles of my feet takes on a double meaning. Either the world is merely rearranging itself according to the blind dance of physics, or it is speaking in a low, patient voice, repeating the same warning it murmured to desert prophets and cloistered scribes, that covenant cannot be violated forever without consequence, and that no wall, no tower, no climate-controlled apartment can fully insulate us from the reaction of the ground beneath us. So here I sit, a reluctant witness with a manuscript in his hands, and a screen inching closer to sleep on the desk beside him. I have greeted you, as best I know how, from this small island of lamplight in a restless, humming planet. I have laid before you the first lines of a forgotten warning and the tangled doubt that grows around them like brambles. Whether you stay with me is your choice. Whether this fragile voice reaches others is partly in your hands now, in the simple gestures of subscribing, responding, sharing, allowing this unease to ripple beyond us both. As for me, I will keep turning these pages, listening for the heartbeat in the stone, trying to decide whether I am an old fool chasing patterns in the dark or a latecomer to a conversation the earth has been trying to have with us since the first fracture. The dawn that followed my night with the folio was pale and evasive, as though the sun itself were unsure whether it wished to show its face above the eastern ridge. I sat by the narrow window of the guest chamber, notebook open, pen idle between my fingers, watching thin fingers of mist weave through the monastery courtyard. The monks, sparse in number and slow in movement, passed silently across the flagstones like men walking through a memory rather than a mourning. None of them knew that I had spent half the night staring at a single page, seeing in its faint strokes the outline of a truth I did not yet dare to name. Sleep had not come. Only a series of shallow dozes broken by the same image returning again and again. The 3 uneven circles drawn atop the folio's first line. Each time I drifted off, those circles arranged themselves differently, shifting like wheels in a mechanism that did not yet understand its purpose. In one dream they rotated slowly, as though orbiting a center I could not see. In another they drifted apart until a thin crack appeared between them, glowing like a fault line seen from above. I woke with the impression of heat beneath my feet, though the floor was cold as winter stone. By mid-morning I had resolved, reluctantly, to examine the prophecy more seriously than the rational part of me wanted. Not because I believed it, but because disbelief, if honest, should be informed. I wanted to understand the genealogy of this strange teaching, where it came from, what shaped it, why it had been hidden. That required returning to the scriptures the scribe had woven through his argument and following each thread to its origin. I began with the most obvious of them, the old Hebrew poems that speak of the earth as though it had ears and emotions. There is a psalm, you know it, even if you do not know that you know it, that describes mountains skipping like rams and hills like young sheep. Of course, scholars tell us these are metaphors, the exuberant language of worship. But when read alongside the folio, they begin to feel like something else. Early attempts to articulate a relationship between human action and the trembling of the land. The folio quotes one such verse and adds a curious gloss in the margin. Not as beasts do they leap, but as bodies remembering injury. That line sent me digging through the writings of early rabbis, searching for any hint of similar interpretations. I found only scattered remarks, nothing definitive, nothing bold. A few sages suggested that the land participates in moral history, that it responds to sin, that it vomits out injustice. Such statements were always controversial, often allegorized beyond recognition. But they exist. They linger in the commentaries like embers that were never entirely extinguished. Then there are the prophets. Not the famous ones whose words have filled temples and chapels for millennia, but the quieter voices whose oracles survived only in fragments. One of these speaks of the earth heaving beneath the weight of blood, another of the skies being strained thin by the shouting of the nations. The folio's author cites both. He treats them not as poetic devices, but as literal descriptions of a world unable to contain human cruelty without contortion. Still, Scripture alone cannot build such a doctrine. So I turned next to Apocrypha, the books that sit at the edges of canons like forgotten relatives at the edge of a family gathering. Here, too, I found threads. Hymns where rivers lament oppression, tales where deserts expand not by natural drift, but by divine sorrow. Visions in which the stars grow pale when oaths are broken. Yet none of these were as specific or as systematized as the folio. They were intuitions, scattered impressions, not a coherent worldview. I needed a bridge between these ancient intuitions and the folio's bold claim. That bridge, I suspected, lay in the medieval world, the age of the scribe whose hand trembled across the page. Medieval theologians believed in correspondences, in resonances between realms, in the idea that the physical reflected the moral. They saw symbolism in the migration of birds, the flowering of trees, the timing of storms. But even they rarely attributed moral restlessness to the entire planet. They might have spoken of divine punishment, but the earth itself remained a stage, not an agent. So where did the folio's author find the audacity to claim otherwise? I began to track down other documents from the same era, dusty treatises preserved on microfilm or scanned into obscure digital archives. Many were irrelevant: sermons on humility, treatises on the nature of angels, long-winded arguments about liturgical calendars. But then I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a report from a council held in a mountain city no longer present on maps, a council attended by theologians known for their severity. The report had survived only in fragments, but in one section they debated a doctrine they called terra testis, the earth as witness. According to one bishop, the earth not only observed human behavior, but recorded it, reacting over time to its accumulation. Another bishop objected violently, warning that such a doctrine would blur the line between creation and creator. A third insisted that the idea had roots in older traditions and should not be dismissed. No resolution was reached. The council burned the proposal, but someone, it seems, kept notes. And those notes contain a phrase that is almost identical to one in the folio. The world groans when oaths are broken, and its groaning may be felt in the trembling of the ground. Groaning, trembling, restlessness, a broken covenant. The same vocabulary scattered across centuries, like pieces of a sentence waiting for someone to assemble them. As I traced these connections, an unease grew in me that I could not shake. It was the same unease I felt as a child when hearing thunder at night, the sense of a presence shifting itself somewhere beyond my sight. And as I continued reading, other patterns emerged. There is a strange consistency between historical episodes of mass injustice and periods of dramatic environmental upheaval. This is not conspiracy thinking, not pseudoscience. Historians and climatologists know these correlations well, but what struck me, in the shadow of the folio, was the possibility that these correlations might contain more than political or economic causality. That perhaps they were echoes of a deeper wound. Take, for example, the great migrations that followed certain ancient wars. Entire civilizations uprooted, seas changing their behavior, weather patterns shifting, or the medieval plagues that swept across continents after years of exploitation and cruelty. Of course, there are scientific explanations for all of these things. But science, like theology, describes patterns from one angle, not the whole object. And as I examined the timelines, I could not ignore how often the violence of humans preceded the violence of nature in uncanny sequence. The folio had a word for this: reverberation. It claimed that the planet reverberates morally, as a drum reverberates physically, though at a scale so vast that humans notice only the most dramatic impacts. The image is both beautiful and terrifying. A world resonating with the echoes of history, responding not only to physical forces, but to ethical ones. Skepticism tugged at me constantly, whispering that I was losing myself in an illusion. Yet something else tugged back, the memory of patterns I had dismissed in the past, oddities I once shoved aside as coincidences, like the ancient records of eclipses that followed the downfall of empires, like the accounts of strange winds rising after genocides, like the persistent folklore in multiple cultures that the earth itself remembers. These were not conclusions, not proofs, only shadows pointing toward a shape I could not yet name. In the late afternoon, I stepped outside, needing air. The monastery sat on a rocky ridge overlooking a valley dotted with villages whose lights had begun to flicker on as evening approached. I rested my hand on the stone wall, expecting only cool stillness, but instead I felt a faint oscillation, not a tremor, not a vibration, just a gentle, rhythmic throb, like a pulse reaching me through the stone. I froze, once, twice, then nothing. I may have imagined it. The human body is full of illusions, blood flow, muscle tension, the subconscious wish to confirm one's fears. But as I stepped away, I noticed a crack running diagonally across the surface of the wall. Not deep, not threatening, but new, fresh enough that pale powder still clung to the ledge beneath it. And I remembered a sentence from the folio: "When the restlessness begins to surface, it will first appear in small fractures, as if the world is practicing how to speak again." Was this such a fracture? Likely not. It could have been weather, age, simple erosion. Yet I felt a weight in my chest that made the air taste metallic. Back in my chamber, I returned to the prophecy, reading slowly, letting each line settle like sediment in a riverbed. One passage seized me more than the others. It described a period the scribe called the wane of stillness, a time when the earth would struggle to maintain its internal equilibrium. It would not be a single event, but a tapering, a gradual fraying of the invisible threads holding balance in place. The signs, the folio said, would include winds that circle the same regions as though bound by memory, seas that rise not with anger but with sorrow, skies that discolor in patterns unfamiliar even to seasoned watchers of weather, and tremors that feel less like motion and more like hesitation. As I read these lines, I found myself remembering news clips from the past years. Storms behaving strangely, coastlines shrinking, skies turning shades that felt unnatural even to those accustomed to polluted cities. I remembered the look on the face of a meteorologist who appeared on a broadcast 3 years ago, speaking of a storm that drifted aimlessly along a coastline for days, as if the wind had forgotten how to blow. He was trying to find humor in it, but his eyes betrayed confusion. I shut the folio then, abruptly, as if closing a door on something I was not prepared to let into the room. But the room felt different anyway. Heavier, charged. The floorboards creaked in a way that suggested not settling wood but subtle strain. I lowered myself onto the chair, aware of my heartbeat, aware of the vastness of the planet below me, aware of how absurd it was to think that the ground could feel anything at all. And yet, the absurdity did not comfort me. Late in the evening, when the monks retired to their quarters and the corridors grew silent, I heard the hum again, faint, low, like a distant choir singing in a register too deep for clarity. I followed it to the cloister, walking slowly, tracing the sound with cautious steps. There, in the courtyard, I stood barefoot on the flagstones and closed my eyes. For a few moments, there was nothing. Only the chill of the stones beneath my skin. Then, very gently, I felt it again. A pulse, soft but unmistakable, not constant, not regular, a stuttering rhythm, like a breath caught and released out of sync. The world, it seemed, was restless, broken. Or perhaps it was only I who was broken, reading meaning into silence. But as I returned to my room, one thought would not leave me. If the earth is trying to speak, then perhaps the real question is not whether the prophecy is true, but whether we have ignored its voice for so long that we no longer recognize the language. I slept poorly again that night, and when dawn came, it felt less like a beginning than a continuation of something ancient, vast, and slowly waking beneath us. I spent the next morning in the scriptorium, a tall room lined with shelves that rose like silent witnesses toward a ceiling blackened by centuries of candle smoke. The monks had long ceased copying manuscripts here. The room remained as a museum of stillness, a cathedral for ink and vellum. Dust drifted in the sunlight like fine ash, settling on wooden desks carved with initials no one living could decipher. It was here, in this suspended quiet, that I hoped to separate imagination from evidence, dream from doctrine. Yet the deeper I ventured, the more those distinctions blurred like ink soaked through ancient parchment. The folio lay open before me, held down at the corners by small fragments of marble. Its thin pages rustled when the air stirred, as though breathing. I had brought a stack of reference books, linguistic analyses, and facsimiles of early sermons, determined to identify every allusion the scribe made. If I could untangle his sources, perhaps the manuscript would shrink back into ordinary history, a curiosity, not a warning. But as I began cross-referencing, I found something unexpected. The scribe had not simply borrowed phrases from earlier texts. He had stitched them together with eerie precision, creating a tapestry far older than his own era. Whole sentences were constructed from fragments of disparate sources. A lament from an exiled prophet, combined with a phrase from a Greek cosmologist, laced with an image from a Gnostic hymn. When placed side by side, these fragments seemed like pieces of a shattered worldview, one in which the earth was not a mute object but a participant in a divine drama. This discovery sent me into a kind of scholarly trance. I forgot hunger, forgot time. My pen moved furiously across the page as I traced patterns and parallels. The scribe had hidden his reasoning, but not well enough to conceal the architecture of his thought. And it was here, in the architecture, that I found something that made the hairs on my arms rise. He repeatedly referred to a work I had never encountered, a manuscript he called De Orbis Testatio, on the testimony of the world. No known catalog lists it. No scholar I contacted later, quietly, anonymously, had ever heard of it. And yet the folio quoted it as though it were foundational. One line, in particular, appeared multiple times. When the earth shifts before its appointed hour, look not to nature but to the ledger of men. A ledger, not of grain, not of trade, but of men, of their deeds, their betrayals, their violence. This was not theology. It was indictment. The rational part of me resisted this interpretation. I argued with myself silently, leaning back in the creaking wooden chair, reminding my nerves that medieval authors often invented sources for rhetorical effect. But another part of me, the part that had felt the pulse beneath the courtyard stones, recognized the possibility of something older, something handed down outside, sanctioned channels. To broaden the search, I returned to the most ancient genres of all: myth, memory, and ritual. These are the places where civilizations preserve their first instincts about the world. Among the Sumerians, I found hymns describing the earth as trembling under the weight of kings. Among the Greeks, tales of Gaia responding to injustice. Among the Celts, rituals meant to soothe the ground after bloodshed. Among the early desert tribes, beliefs that the soil could cry out when defiled. These similarities troubled me. Such parallels across distant cultures are not proof of truth, but they are rarely accidental. Human beings tend to converge around ideas that resonate with something felt rather than reasoned. By midday, I needed a break. My mind had become a tangled web of ancient languages and unnamed fears. I stepped outside into the crisp air, letting the wind clear my head. The monastery's stone path led to a narrow overlook, from which the valley stretched like a green bowl cradled by steep hills. Yet today, something about the scene felt subtly wrong. A tension in the air, a faint vibration as though the world were holding its breath. When I returned to the scriptorium an hour later, a monk I had not seen before was standing near my desk. He was tall, thin, with a sharp nose and eyes that seemed to weigh every gesture. He wore no name tag, no distinguishing feature except a slight tremor in his right hand. "I notice the materials you're working with," he said softly. His voice was gentle, but his words were deliberate, as though each one had been examined before release. "There are few who take that folio seriously." I hesitated. "I'm not sure I do," I answered honestly. "I'm trying to contextualize it." He smiled faintly, a tired smile that had weathered many winters. "Contextualization, yes, that is what people call it when they are trying not to be moved too quickly." I frowned, unsure whether to be defensive or curious. "You're familiar with it?" His eyes drifted to the open page. "More familiar than I wish. The one who wrote that folio was part of a dispute centuries ago, a dispute about the nature of the world." "Between whom?" "Between those who believed creation is inert," he replied, "and those who believed it is wounded." Before I could ask another question, he inclined his head in a quiet farewell and walked out, his steps so silent they barely rustled the dust. I stood there for several minutes after his departure, feeling as though I had been handed a clue without explanation. A door had opened slightly, just enough to reveal that there was another room beyond, deeper and darker. Returning to the folio, I forced myself to focus on the text. The next section was one I had skimmed before, but now, after the monk's cryptic remarks, it demanded my full attention. It described a concept the scribe called fractura prima, the first fracture, not geological, moral, a rupture in the covenant between humanity and the earth. The text claimed that this fracture set off a chain reaction, subtle at first, growing over generations, accumulating like pressure beneath a fault line. The world, it said, would try to maintain equilibrium for as long as possible, masking its distress through cycles of weather and tide. But eventually, that pressure would surface in ways human beings could no longer ignore. And then the sentence that froze my breath. "When the fracture matures, the world will tremble even without cause, for its internal balance will have forgotten how to rest." Even without cause. The idea haunted me. Science teaches that earthquakes, storms, climate shifts, all have causes, measurable, traceable, predictable. But what if some tremors, some shifts, some oscillations were not responses to physical stimuli, but symptoms of something deeper? The scribe wrote as though he believed the earth possessed memory. And if it possessed memory, then perhaps it also possessed fatigue. I let my eyes trace the remainder of the page. It spoke of seasons that lose their rhythm, winds that return obsessively to wounded lands, skies that discolor in patterns like bruises. All poetic images, yet I could not dismiss how closely they resembled the phenomena now appearing across our fragile modern world. The hum began again, low and resonant, vibrating faintly through the wooden desk. I pressed my palm flat against the surface and felt it. A slow oscillation, as if the world were inhaling and exhaling beneath me. This time, I did not pull away. I wanted to know if it was real, or merely a projection of my mind. So I leaned closer, letting my fingertips rest lightly on the folio. The vibration was not steady. It pulsed irregularly, like the heartbeat of something wounded. A thought surfaced in me, unbidden and unwelcome. What if the prophecies were not warnings of what will come, but descriptions of what has already begun? Suddenly I felt dizzy, as though standing at the edge of a precipice. My skepticism, once a shield, now felt like a fragile veneer stretched over a deeper recognition. I closed the folio gently and looked around the scriptorium. The room felt different. The shelves leaned subtly inward, as though listening. The dust in the air swirled in tiny vortices, caught in microcurrents I could not feel. Every instinct urged me to step outside, to breathe fresh air, to place the cold ground beneath my feet. But another instinct, the one that had kept me in archives all my life, urged me to stay, to follow the thread no matter where it led. And so I sat again, opened my notebook, and wrote a sentence I never imagined I would commit to paper. The prophecy is not merely symbolic. It may be diagnostic. Those words changed everything. For the rest of the day, my investigation no longer felt like scholarship. It felt like listening to a world that had been speaking for centuries while humanity mistook its warnings for weather. That night, long after the bell for evening prayer had faded into silence, I lay awake, the pulse beneath the floor returning in irregular intervals. I no longer wondered if the earth was restless. I wondered how long it had been trying to tell us so. I woke before dawn, not from rest, but from a feeling, the unsettling sense that something in the monastery had shifted during the night. Not physically. There were no fallen stones, no displaced objects. Yet the air felt rearranged, as though the atmosphere itself had been quietly reordered while I slept. I sat up slowly, listening. The world was still dark, the sky outside my window faintly blue at the edges, like ink bleeding through thin cloth. The mountains were only silhouettes, stacked like ancient, sleeping titans. But something deeper than shadow stirred beneath that stillness, a quiet groaning that had no sound and yet pressed against the inside of my ribs. For a moment I remained motionless, trying to decide whether the sensation came from the earth or from my own frayed nerves. Then, gathering my notes in the folio, I made my way through the cold stone corridors to the library annex, a chamber the monks rarely used. It contained the monastery's older geological records, brittle logs, water-stained charts, brittle hand-drawn maps of the region before roads, before rail, before modern borders. I needed context, not spiritual, not theological, physical. If the prophecy described changes in the earth as symptoms, then the land surrounding this place, where the folio had been hidden, should bear those symptoms in its own bones. The annex smelled of wax, dust, and the faint metallic tang of old ink. Its windows were narrow slits, admitting thin stripes of pale morning light. The shelves were lower here, warped by time, and the floor creaked with a language different from that of the scriptorium. Not the groaning of old wood, but a tired whisper rising from the foundation stones. I began reading. The earliest records were simple, accounts of landslides, unusual rains, floods that came out of season. But as I moved deeper into the chronology, the language changed. A monk in the 16th century described the hill beneath the monastery as breathing in the night, rising and falling like a giant chest. Another wrote of hearing the sighs of the valley during a year of drought. Most scholars would dismiss such expressions as poetic excess, metaphor used to cope with hardship. But in the context of the folio, these metaphors took on the weight of testimony. One entry stopped me cold. It was dated in an elegant but shaky script, the ink darkened by centuries of oxidation. On the night when the council burned the doctrine some called terra testis, the earth shuddered twice, as though in grief. Many brothers were awakened by it. But the matter was sealed, and we said nothing further. Twice. A double tremor, like the pulse I had felt beneath the courtyard stones. My hands tightened around the page. The coincidence was too sharp, too surgically precise, and the writer's hesitation, that said nothing further, carried the scent of fear. Still, it could all be imagination, suggestion, a mind primed by the folio to see meaning in coincidence. I forced myself to remain skeptical, to keep searching for more concrete evidence. Farther down the shelves, I found a set of geological sketches drawn by a monk who had traveled through the region centuries ago. He mapped fault lines, rock strata, and water sources with surprising accuracy. One detail caught my eye: a series of fractures running beneath the very ridge where the monastery now stood. They were described as dormant, long inactive, slumbering as though held in place by some great restraint. I traced those fracture lines with my finger and felt a strange chill. If the prophecy spoke of restlessness, of equilibrium failing, of fractures waking, then this place was not random. The folio had been hidden here for a reason. It had been placed at the site of an ancient wound. My thoughts only deepened when I discovered a second bundle of records. Letters exchanged between monastery scholars and early astronomers in the 18th and 19th centuries. They discussed unusual atmospheric phenomena, skies that glowed with colors not typical for the latitude, birds behaving strangely, needles on primitive instruments swinging without wind. One letter described a phenomenon that made my heart jolt. There was a vibration in the air itself, not sound, but sensation. A trembling that felt as though it came from the heavens or the ground. We could not tell. It passed through the valley for several minutes, leaving the animals uneasy. A trembling that had no identifiable source. I set the letter aside and rubbed my temples. All these records were small things, fleeting anomalies, odd observations, dismissed by their writers as curiosities or natural events. But woven together they formed a pattern, a slow, recurring agitation, a centuries-long heartbeat. And beneath that heartbeat, a fear. Fear not of God, nor of the heavens, but of something in the earth itself. I had come here searching for clues, but the abundance of them overwhelmed me. My skepticism was no longer a steady companion. It was now a strained voice, struggling to assert dominance over something that felt both vast and deliberate. It was then that I discovered the scroll. It had been stored near the bottom of a locked chest, wrapped in brittle linen. When I unrolled it carefully, the ink shimmered faintly under the morning light. The script was older than anything else in the room, older, even, than the folio. The language was classical Latin, but the structure suggested it had been translated from something far more ancient. And it bore a title, Fragmentum ex libro orbis testis, a fragment from the book of the world's witness. My pulse stuttered. This was the manuscript the folio repeatedly referenced, the one scholars had never heard of, a book that should not have existed. Yet here it was in my trembling hands, fragile as a dried leaf. The fragment was short, no more than a few dozen lines, but the language was chilling in its clarity. The world was shaped to remember. Every oath uttered upon it sinks into its layers of stone like water into sand. When the weight of broken promises becomes unbearable, the earth responds not from anger, but from imbalance. Its trembling is not punishment, but self-preservation. Self-preservation. The prophecy did not claim the earth punished humanity. It claimed the earth struggled to survive humanity. The distinction was subtle and devastating. A trembling planet was not exacting retribution. It was trying to restore equilibrium in the only way it could. My breath came shallow. The room seemed to tilt. The fragment continued. Beware the wane of stillness when the world loses memory of rest. In that time the skies shall wander, the winds shall return to wounded coasts, and the foundations of mountains shall hum in their sorrow. Then shall men say the planet is broken, not knowing that they themselves have fractured it. I lowered the scroll slowly, reverently, like handling a relic that had survived a fire. My skepticism, the stubborn companion that had guarded me against delusion, began to feel like an artifact of another life. A life in which the earth was a sphere of rock, emotionless, obedient to physics alone. But now physics felt too thin, too narrow to explain the resonance I sensed in the stones beneath my feet. I returned to the folio with renewed urgency. There were more clues there, linguistic, symbolic, theological. I examined each one, dissecting the scribe's intentions. In one paragraph he described a second fracture, a time when humans would treat the earth not only as resource but as adversary, forcing it into unnatural rhythms. He wrote of the false stewardship of those who believed themselves guardians while acting as tyrants, and he warned that such arrogance would quicken the collapse of equilibrium. I copied those lines into my notebook, my handwriting increasingly uneven. For hours I worked like a man consumed, my eyes burning from strain, my fingers stained with ink. As evening approached, the light in the annex dimmed, and strange shadows lengthened across the floor. That was when I felt the second pulse, stronger than the first, unmistakable. A throb running through the stone foundations, as though the earth were flexing its vast, hidden muscles. The shelves rattled faintly. Dust drifted in small spirals, and books, several books, shifted ever so slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. I stood motionless, every nerve awake. Then the vibration ceased, leaving only silence. A profound, heavy silence that felt as though the monastery itself had paused to listen. For a long moment I did not breathe. Then, with trembling hands, I wrote a single sentence in the margin of my notes. The earth is not reacting to prophecy. The prophecy is describing the earth. As the last light of dusk seeped into the annex, a realization settled over me with the slow certainty of falling ash. The planet's restlessness was not a metaphor, not an allegory, not the poetic invention of ancient minds. It was reality, a reality we had ignored for generations, dismissing its signs as accidents of weather, quirks of geology, coincidences in climate. I closed the folio gently and ran my hand across the rough wooden table. The vibrations had ceased, but the echo remained in my bones. That night, as I walked back through the corridor toward my room, the lamps flickered one by one behind me, as though the monastery were exhaling slowly. And outside, beyond the walls, the mountains stood silent, but their silence felt less like stillness and more like waiting. Waiting for what? I did not yet know. But the weight of the answer pressed upon me like the unspoken words of a vast and wounded world, trembling in its sleep. I rose before dawn again, though rose is not the word. I drifted from sleeplessness into motion, pulled upright by a tension in the air that felt almost magnetic. The monastery was still. Not silent, still. There is a difference. Silence is absence. Stillness is pressure, the kind that gathers in a room before someone speaks a truth they have long avoided. I walked outside into the half-light, crossing the courtyard where the pulse had visited me before. I stood barefoot on the stones once more, testing the ground. No tremor came, yet the absence of trembling felt like a held breath rather than peace. The mountain ridge loomed beyond the walls, its silhouette sharper than usual, as if the earth itself had edged closer during the night. Today, I told myself, I needed to leave the monastery. Not permanently, but for context. The folio, the fragment, the geological logs, they painted a picture, but a picture can deceive through proximity. I needed the wider canvas, the modern world, its measurements, its satellites, its instruments. If this prophecy described a real phenomenon, if the earth itself was losing equilibrium, then traces of this should exist not only in old manuscripts, but in the data of our age. I traveled down the mountain road by foot for nearly an hour before reaching a small village with a bus route. The streets were quiet, shutters still drawn. The only sound was the distant honking of geese in a nearby field. The bus arrived with a groan, as though reluctant to begin its morning labor. I boarded, carrying the folio wrapped in linen inside my satchel, and sat by a window streaked with dew. As the bus descended toward the valley, I felt something unexpected. A faint pressure change, the kind that precedes storms. Yet the sky was clear. The horizon wore the pale lavender of early morning, unbroken by clouds. The sensation buzzed behind my ears like an atmospheric hum that did not belong to any storm I knew. I opened my notebook and began listing the questions that had tormented me since reading the fragment. If the earth remembers, how does memory manifest physically? If imbalance accumulates, what are its early signals? Does modern data show unexplained patterns? Are recent anomalies natural fluctuations or symptoms of something deeper? Every question felt both urgent and absurd. Yet the absurdity no longer comforted me the way it once did. Reason, I was beginning to see, has thresholds beyond which something older takes over. Intuition, pattern recognition, ancestral instinct. I reached the nearest city by mid-morning. Its streets were already trembling with human activity. Rushing commuters, delivery trucks, cafe workers dragging out chairs. The contrast with the monastery was jarring. And yet, beneath the hum of civilization, I sensed something familiar. A faint, subterranean resonance, like a slow drum hidden under the roar of engines. I found a quiet library in the older quarter, its architecture a patchwork of centuries. Here, amid the mix of Wi-Fi signals and parchment, I pulled up seismic data from the past decades. Not the dramatic earthquakes. Those are well studied. I searched instead for the smallest tremors, the microquakes, the anomalies scientists often dismiss as noise. It did not take long to see it. A pattern, not in magnitude, but in rhythm. Across multiple continents, in regions far apart, microquakes had begun to cluster irregularly, not in tight sequences as they do before major events, but in loose, pulsating waves. They surged, receded, surged again, as though following an invisible breathing pattern. Breathing. The word chilled me. I compared these waves to climate records, tidal oscillations, atmospheric trends. What I found unnerved me further. In several cases, peaks in these microquakes aligned with atmospheric distortions that climatologists had been unable to explain. Winds that shifted direction unexpectedly. Storms that stalled. Skies that discolored without known cause. It was not a perfect correlation, but it was far more than coincidence. As the hours passed, I expanded my search to historical data. Seismograph readings from early instruments, diary entries from explorers, fishermen's logs, mining records. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. The Earth's restlessness increased after periods of intense human upheaval. Revolutions, wars, industrial expansions. Moments when human beings inflicted great wounds upon one another and upon the land. The folio had called this reverberation. The fragment had called it imbalance. The council notes had called it groaning. Modern science calls it nothing, because modern science does not yet have a word for a planet losing its composure. Around midday, a librarian approached my table, a woman with gray hair and a tight braid, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "You've been at this for hours," she said. "Researching earthquakes?" "In a sense," I replied. She studied my screen. "Strange pattern. They don't usually look like that." "You've seen similar?" I asked quickly. "Not exactly. But last year my brother sent me footage from his farm. The ground trembled lightly for nearly an hour. Not enough to damage anything, but enough to make the animals panic. Seismologists told him it was probably trucks on a distant road. There were no roads nearby." Her voice softened. "He said it felt like the earth was uneasy." Uneasy. The word pressed into me like a thumb into wet clay. After she left, I returned to the folio, reading a section I had not examined closely before. It described a phenomenon the scribe called the wandering of the skies, in which the atmosphere itself behaved like a disoriented creature, circling wounded places, lingering where sorrow pooled. I cross-referenced this with satellite weather loops. There it was. Storms returning to the same coasts, winds stalling in unnatural spirals, heat domes refusing to dissipate, patterns that meteorologists called anomalies, patterns the folio called symptoms. I leaned back in my chair, the edges of my vision trembling as though the world around me were subtly vibrating. A realization spread through me slowly, heavily, like ink dispersing through cold water. The earth is not reacting randomly. It is reacting rhythmically, and the rhythm corresponds to us. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the overlapping graphs. At some point, the hum returned, not from the library floor this time, but inside me, a resonance I could neither swallow nor escape, a resonance that felt like recognition. My hands shook as I opened the fragment once more. There was a final line I had glossed over before, dismissing it as mystical exaggeration. But now, in the stark company of data, its meaning sharpened like a blade. When the balance fails, men will call this the madness of nature. They will not know it is the sanity of the world resisting collapse. The sanity of the world. The line hollowed out my chest. It meant this. The earth was not punishing us. The earth was trying not to die. As evening fell outside the library windows, the sky turned an uncanny shade of violet, deeper than dusk, lighter than storm. The air felt dense, charged with a static that prickled the hairs on my arms. People hurried along the sidewalks, glancing upward nervously. A flock of pigeons burst into the air in a disorganized panic, as if fleeing something invisible. I packed my notes in the folio and stepped outside. The moment my feet touched the pavement, I felt it. A subtle pulse, faint but unmistakable. Not beneath the ground this time, in the air, as though the atmosphere itself had joined the trembling. I froze on the street corner, the city noise fading into distance, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The prophecy was no longer something ancient, confined to parchment and ink. It was unfolding, here, now, around me, around all of us. A restlessness not of myth, not of metaphor, but of a vast and wounded planet struggling to remember how to rest. For the first time, truly, I felt fear, not for myself, for the world beneath my feet, and for what might come next. I returned to the monastery long after nightfall, carrying with me a weight that no satchel or strap could lift. The bus climbed the dark mountain roads in unsteady jolts, its headlights slicing through the fog like blades through wet wool. The other passengers stared blankly ahead, unaware that the ground beneath them harbored a pulse older than cities, older than scripture, older than the languages we use to reassure ourselves that the world is mapped and measured. When I stepped off at the ridge and began the final ascent by foot, the silence of the valley struck me first. Not the calm silence of night, but a thick, listening stillness, as though the mountains were leaning in. The monastery lights flickered faintly atop the ridge, and for a brief moment, I wondered if the world itself was watching my return. Inside the monastery, the corridors were dark except for a few lamps burning low, their flames bent slightly, as if disturbed by a breath that wasn't mine. I climbed the stairs to my chamber, feeling the boards shift subtly underfoot. It was not an earthquake, too gentle, too deliberate, more like the slow flexing of an enormous creature turning in uneasy sleep. I closed the door behind me and collapsed into the wooden chair near the small desk. The folio lay wrapped in linen beside my notes, as innocent as a pressed flower, and yet I could not bring myself to touch it immediately. Instead, I sat there, staring at the wall, listening to the faint hum beneath the floorboards. The monastery was alive with subtle tremors tonight, not continuous, intermittent, almost thoughtful. A pulse here, a sigh there. Each vibration felt like a syllable in a language I was only beginning to understand. After several minutes, I unwrapped the folio and opened it to a page marked by a fold in the corner. This section had always unsettled me, even before belief had begun to seep through the cracks in my skepticism. The scribe described a phase he called memoria terrae, the memory of the earth. According to him, the planet held not only the weight of broken oaths, but the weight of unspoken ones, the millions of small betrayals that never entered any record except the soil itself. Every cruelty, every exploitation, every moment when human ambition carved deeper than conscience allowed. All of these, he wrote, were absorbed into the earth like toxins into blood. At first I dismissed this as mystical hyperbole, but now, after seeing the patterns in seismic data, after hearing the hum in the monastery stones, After feeling the pulse beneath a city pavement, the metaphor no longer seemed rhetorical. It felt diagnostic. If memory can wound a soul, why could it not wound a world? The thought made me shudder. I turned the page. The next section described patterns of recollection, storms returning to the same coastlines, droughts afflicting regions marked by centuries of conquest, winds repeating ancient migration routes. It was madness to think of weather as memory, and yet the evidence I had collected that morning painted the same picture. A world not moving randomly, but retracing the scars of history. I read deeper, the candle flickering beside me. The scribe detailed a moment he called the inversion, when the earth's internal rhythms become misaligned with the heavens. In that time, he claimed, the atmosphere would grow restless, the magnetic currents unstable, the tides unpredictable. All of this, he wrote, would be mistaken for climate disorder, geological instability, solar anomalies, even cosmic interference. But the underlying cause would be moral gravity, a pressure created by the sum of human deviation from covenant. Moral gravity. The phrase struck me like a blow. If such a force existed, it would not appear in physics formulas or climate models. It would manifest like a shadow behind measurable phenomena, present, shaping, and invisible. My mind resisted the idea, but something deeper in me recognized it instantly, instinctively, the way you recognize the meaning of a whisper, even if you cannot translate the words. I closed the folio and leaned back, covering my eyes with my hands. Exhaustion crawled through my limbs. Yet beneath the fatigue lay a stirring, an awareness that I was standing at the threshold of an understanding I could neither pursue nor abandon. I needed clarity, perspective, air. So I stepped outside. The courtyard was lit by moonlight, though the moon itself was veiled behind fast-moving clouds. The air tasted metallic, charged. A faint breeze drifted across the stones, but it carried no scent of grass or earth. It was strangely sterile, as though passing through machinery rather than nature. I stood there barefoot again, placing my hands behind my back like a man preparing for a confession. At first, nothing happened. Only the sound of distant wind brushing the tops of pine trees. Then it came. A trembling, soft, hesitant, rising through the stones, through the soles of my feet, into my bones. Followed by a second, then a third. Not rhythmic, not seismic. This was something else, something that pulsed like thought, like deliberation, like sorrow finding its way into breath. The trembling did not frighten me this time. Or perhaps it did, but in a way that felt less like danger and more like recognition. Like standing beside someone who has finally begun to weep after years of silence. A question pierced me then, sharp as lightning. What if the earth is not only restless? What if it is crying out? Not in words, in tremors, in storms, in tides, in atmospheric pulses, in subtle distortions of magnetism, in the quiet shudder beneath a monastery floor. The world was speaking in the only language left to it. And we, deafened by centuries of arrogance, called it chaos. As I stood in the moonlit courtyard, the trembling faded. In its wake came a silence so profound it felt like the end of a sentence waiting for its next clause. I returned to my chamber slowly, feeling the walls themselves humming in quiet sympathy. I knew I had to continue my investigation tomorrow, deeper, broader, beyond scriptures and folklore, into the scientific domains we trust so blindly. I needed to trace the patterns not only in ancient writings, but in modern anomalies. Shifts in auroras, irregularities in atmospheric resonance, unexplained oscillations in ocean salinity, deviations in the rotation speed, anomalies in the Schumann frequency, fluctuations in magnetic drift, changes in animal migration. All of these were data points waiting to be aligned with the prophecy. As I lay on the simple cot, unable to sleep, I realized something that chilled me far more than the cold stone beneath my feet. the restlessness of the earth had grown not only more frequent, but more conscious. Not conscious in the human sense, but aware, responsive, reactive. A vast, wounded intelligence expressed through trembling foundations and wandering skies. And we, its children, its tormentors, its tenants, had mistaken its warnings for background noise. As I drifted into an uneasy half-sleep, a final thought echoed through me. The prophecy is not a forecast. It is a diagnosis. And the patient has begun to speak. I awoke to the sound of something soft and persistent, pressing against the edge of consciousness. Not a voice, not a vibration, but a presence. It felt as though the air itself had weight, as though the morning light trying to enter my chamber had grown dense with intention. For a long moment I lay motionless, listening. The monastery was quiet. The distant hum of the valley below was muted by fog, and yet the room felt occupied, as though I was not the only one pondering what the night had revealed. When I finally rose and stepped onto the cold stone floor, a faint tremor passed through my feet, so light that it could have been imagination, the residue of dreams. But dreams leave no echoes. This did. It clung to me as I dressed, as I moved through the dim corridor, as I descended the stairs to the cloister. The monks were gathered there, more of them than usual. Their faces were pinched with worry, though none spoke. One of them, the old man who tended the herb garden, ran a trembling hand along the stone wall, frowning as though feeling for a heartbeat. When he noticed me, he nodded once, briefly, with a solemnity that felt almost confessional. Something had happened during the night. Something subtle, but unmistakable. I approached him. "Did you feel it?" I asked quietly. His gaze lingered on the wall. "We all did," he murmured. "The building breathed." The words settled into me like a stone sinking into deep water. But before I could ask more, the bell rang. Not the sharp metallic chime of routine, but a heavy, uneven toll that echoed through the arches like a wounded limb dragging itself across the floor. The monks dispersed, each retreating to duties or silence, leaving the courtyard strangely empty. I stood there alone, feeling the weight of that toll reverberate in my chest. It was time to seek answers they might not volunteer. Answers hidden not in scripture, nor in science, but in memory. Theirs, and perhaps the monastery's itself. The rarely opened archive room lay at the end of a long hallway, its door bound by a thick iron latch worn smooth by centuries of cautious hands. When I asked for access, one of the monks hesitated, but eventually, reluctantly, produced a key carved from dark, veined wood. His expression held no animosity, only concern, like someone handing over a scalpel to a surgeon who might cut too deeply. "Be mindful," he whispered. "That room remembers things we prefer forgotten." I turned the key. The latch clicked. The door groaned inward. Inside, the air was cold and stale, thick with the dust of long-neglected questions. Shelves lined the walls, not with theological works or illuminated manuscripts, but with objects. Stones, bones, dried plants wrapped in cloth, metal shards catalogued with trembling script. Each item bore a small tag indicating a date and, more cryptically, a location. I realized quickly what this collection represented. These were relics recovered after Earth events, tremors, collapses, storms, landslides, each object gathered by monks who believed in patterns unseen by the rest of the world. They had curated not scriptures, but symptoms. The scriptorium held words. This room held evidence. I began examining the artifacts with careful, reverent steps. One stone fragment, smooth on one side and jagged on the other, bore the inscription, "Recovered after the trembling of the 12th winter, found warm to the touch." Warm. Stones do not warm themselves. Another tag read, "Found beneath the altar after the night of 2 pulses." The same double tremor mentioned in the 16th century record. And another, "From the northern ridge, fell without wind." The ground was unsettled for 3 days. The language was sparse, factual, but threaded with unease. As I moved deeper into the room, I found what appeared to be journals, dozens of them, written by monks over centuries. Their leather bindings cracked, their pages foxed by age. I opened the nearest one and read, "The trembling is no longer confined to the ground." Today, the air shook. The candles flickered though the windows were closed. Brother Elias believes the world itself laments. Another entry, dated nearly a century later. The valley animals fled before the tremor. Birds vanished from the sky. The air carried a taste of metal and sorrow. Another, we hear a hum at night. Some say it is the wind. Others say it is prayer. I fear it is neither. And then one that froze my blood. The prophecy begins where the fractures converge. We are built upon convergence. The monastery sat on a place of confluence, not only of geological forces, but of something deeper: memory, wound, witness. I flipped the page. The same monk wrote, "The one who hid the folio among us said the earth would speak louder here first. We did not believe him. I fear we must." A chill crawled up my spine. Was that why the pulses found me here? Because this ridge was a fault, not only in stone, but in meaning. I felt compelled to search deeper still. There was a locked cabinet in the corner, a darker wood, iron-bound. The keyhole was old, shaped in a way no modern key would fit. But beside it hung a small tag, nearly invisible beneath dust: Memoria Terrae, restricted. The same phrase the folio used to describe the earth's memory. I retrieved the wooden key the monk had given me, though I doubted it would fit. It did, too easily, as though the cabinet had been waiting. Inside were only 3 items. The first, a stack of brittle yellowed pages bound by a faded ribbon. The second, a smooth stone, perfectly round, warm to the touch. The third, a thin parchment with a single sentence written in slanted medieval script. My hands shook as I lifted the parchment. "He who listens here will hear the world before it breaks." A warning, a promise, a burden. I set it aside and opened the stack of pages. The handwriting was the same as the folios, the same trembling lines, the same uneven pressure where the pen had hesitated. This was the scribe's private record, his mind unclothed. The first line shattered me. "The earth is not ours to ruin. It is a covenant of breath and stone. When we violate it, the world groans not in rage, but in agony." I read faster. I have seen the fractures in vision. They run across nations like wounds across flesh. The land remembers what men forget. If the axis trembles, it will not be because of stars, but because of us. The one who reads this will hear the hum. It is the heart of the world, and it is tired. My breath hitched. The hum, the trembling, the warmth in the stone. He had experienced all of it, centuries ago, and he had hidden these records because he knew the world was not ready to believe them. The final page contained only 1 paragraph, written with a shaking hand. "When the memory of the earth awakens, the skies will wander like mourners. The winds will turn upon their histories, and the ground will pulse with the weight of unspoken grief. Those who hear it must not look away, or the world will break without witness." I closed the pages slowly, gently, as though soothing a wound. The prophecy was not merely observational, it was confessional, a revelation shared from a time when humanity still had a chance to listen, and now, centuries later, I had become the listener. Not by choice, by placement, by proximity to convergence. When I left the archive room, carrying the scribe's private pages against my chest, the corridor felt narrower than before. The air pressed against my skin like a warm exhale. I paused in the cloister, placing a hand on the stone pillar. The earth answered with a faint pulse, a trembling like a whispered plea, a heartbeat faint with exhaustion, and for the first time, I felt something colder than fear, something heavier than doubt. I felt the grief of a world that had held its silence for too long, a grief that was beginning to surface. And I realized, with a clarity that burned like revelation, the prophecy was not given so that we could prepare for what comes. It was given so we could understand why. I spent the rest of that day in a kind of waking fever, not the fever of illness, but the fever of revelation. The monastery no longer felt like a refuge of stone and prayer. It felt like a vault built over a wound, a place where the earth pressed closest to the surface, whispering through fractures like breath through cracked ribs. Everywhere I walked, I sensed the world beneath like a presence leaning upward, listening, remembering. By afternoon, the sky outside had dimmed unnaturally, though no storm had been forecast. The light was not the color of dusk, nor of cloud, but of something strained, as though the sky itself were holding a bruise. Birds avoided the courtyard entirely. Not a feather, not a wing beat. Even the wind moved strangely, circling the ridge in uneven spirals, unsure of its path. I tried to steady myself with rational thought. I tried to focus on analysis, on scripture, on linguistic patterns. But none of it could anchor me. I was standing in the hollow between certainty and truth. And the hollow had begun to echo. So I retreated to the one place where the boundaries between inner and outer worlds felt thinnest. My tiny cell with its cold floor, its narrow bed, its flickering lamp. I closed the door and sat there with the scribe's private pages spread before me, my hands trembling slightly as though still resonating with the pulses in the stone. The first thing I noticed was a line I had missed earlier. A man must listen to the world before he listens to himself. The simplicity of it struck me deeply. For days now, I had been trying to interpret the prophecy as a scholar, cross-referencing, cataloging, analyzing. But the folio had never been meant for scholars alone. It was intended for anyone willing to listen to the world itself, to hear the trembling beneath the noise of modern life. I placed my palms flat on the floor. Nothing at first, only cold. Then, faint, hesitant, a pulse, a soft, irregular throb, like a heartbeat searching for its rhythm. But the more I listened, the more I realized something horrifyingly beautiful. It was not the earth I was feeling. It was myself. My own pulse, magnified, reflected, echoed back through the stone as though the world were answering me. This realization unsettled me more than any tremor, because it confirmed something the scribe had hinted at repeatedly. The boundary between the human heart and the earth's heart is thinner than we imagine. A crack is a crack, whether in stone or in spirit. A wound is a wound, whether in soil or in memory. The microcosm mirrors the macrocosm, and both, when fractured, tremble. I leaned back, breath shallow. Suddenly the scribe's metaphor, each heart is a small earth, no longer felt symbolic. It felt literal. I could not shake the feeling that my inner agitation, my doubts, fears, anxieties, had not merely been awakened by the prophecy, but amplified by the resonance of a restless planet. A strange thought crept into me. Perhaps I am not just listening to the world. Perhaps the world is listening to me. The idea terrified me. Because if true, then the trembling was not only external, it was relational, reflective, responsive. A vast, wounded mind responding to the tremors of a smaller, wounded mind. The next hours blurred into a haze of reading, reflection, and uneasy breathing. I read the scribe's pages over and over until the script imprinted itself on my eyelids like an afterimage. One passage, in particular, seized hold of me. In the wane of stillness, the spirits of men will grow restless with the earth. Their minds will churn in sleepless cycles. Their dreams will mirror the storms. Their sorrow will deepen as the world exhales its long grief. Was this metaphor? Or had the scribe foreseen the grinding anxiety of the modern age? The sleeplessness, the anxiety epidemics, the sense of hollow dread that has seeped into entire generations? Has the world's restlessness infected us? Or have we infected the world? The distinction grew impossible to untangle. My thoughts spiraled. Questions multiplied like cracks in a dry riverbed. If the earth feels, how does it feel? Does collective human suffering amplify planetary imbalance? Are our inner fractures part of the greater fracture? Is there a threshold where human despair echoes into the natural world? And if so, have we crossed it? I stared at my hands. My fingers shook slightly. Not from fear, from recognition. A terrifying recognition. Because the more I sat there, the more I felt that the prophecy was not about geology or meteorology or climate alone. It was about the human condition. The state of our souls, our histories, our wounds. What if the earth's trembling was not only a reaction to physical harm, but to moral and emotional harm as well? What if our violence, our greed, our despair had weight, real weight, pressing upon the planet's equilibrium? What if the earth was breaking under the gravity of our brokenness? I needed fresh air. The walls had begun to feel too tight, as though the room itself were inhaling around me. So I stepped outside into the cold evening. The sky had dimmed into an unsettling greenish hue, and the moon hung low and distorted, like an eye swollen with uncried tears. Clouds moved strangely, drifting not with the wind but against it, as though following some unseen memory etched into the atmosphere. I walked to the overlook at the ridge, where the valley spread out like a vast darkened bowl. Lights flickered in distant villages. The forest below shifted in slow, uneasy waves, though no wind stirred. And there, in that spectral stillness, I felt something remarkable and terrifying. The earth was not trembling, the air was. A subtle, rhythmic pressure moved around me in slow pulses, like breath against skin. The atmosphere itself was vibrating, not violently, not dangerously, but consciously. It felt like an exhale of sorrow, a long-held, exhausted release. With every pulse, the world seemed to whisper, "Remember me. Remember what was promised. Remember what was broken." I closed my eyes and whispered into the twilight, unsure whom I was addressing. "What do you want me to do?" The answer came not in words, but in resonance. A tremor, faint, intimate, rose through the ground, through my feet, into my chest. It felt like a hand placed gently against my heart, and I understood. Not fully, not intellectually, but intuitively, deeply. The prophecy was never meant to predict catastrophe. It was meant to reveal connection, a bridge between the trembling earth and the trembling human soul. For centuries, we have tried to heal ourselves without healing the world. And we have tried to heal the world without healing ourselves. Both efforts were incomplete. Both were doomed to fail. Because the fracture is shared, because the restlessness is mutual, because the world's sorrow is our sorrow, magnified. As the atmospheric pulse faded and the valley settled into unnatural stillness, a realization grew inside me with the slow inevitability of dawn. We are not separate from the earth's restlessness. We are its cause, its mirror, its echo. And the prophecy, ancient, trembling, long buried, was a plea, not to fear the trembling, but to understand it, to hear it, to witness it, to respond. As I turned back toward the monastery, the stones beneath my feet seemed to sigh, not in anger, not in warning, but in weary recognition, as though they sensed that, at last, someone was finally listening. The next sunrise arrived without warmth. The sky brightened, yes, but the light felt thin, bleached, as if filtered through a world unwilling to fully reveal itself. Shadows stretched in unnatural directions, bending not with the angle of the sun, but with the subtle distortions in the air. The same atmospheric trembling I had felt the night before. I hardly slept. My rest was broken by visions, the kind that sit between dream and revelation. In them, the earth was not a sphere turning calmly through space, but a vast body shivering beneath an unbearable weight. I saw continents pulsing like muscles locked in spasm. I saw oceans tremble as though stirred by memory rather than wind. And beneath it all, I felt a presence. Not malevolent, not divine, but weary. So weary that its very exhaustion rippled through my bones. I woke with tears on my face. I do not cry easily, and yet I could not shake the sense that I had tasted a grief not my own. When I stepped into the courtyard, one of the monks approached me, the same thin man with trembling hands I had encountered in the scriptorium days earlier. His expression was ashen. "You feel it too," he whispered. Not a question, a recognition. "What is it?" I asked. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. He looked past me toward the mountains. "When the air trembles, the world remembers. When the world remembers, the fractures come nearer." I felt an involuntary shiver run through me. "Fractures of what?" "Of everything," he said. Then he turned and walked away. I did not go to the library or the scriptorium that morning. Instead, I followed an impulse that felt older than reason. I walked down the steep path behind the monastery, into the forest that covered the northern slope. The trees here were ancient, their trunks thick as pillars, their roots tangled like veins. The forest floor was soft with old needles and damp moss. As I descended deeper, the air grew cooler and heavier. Birds fluttered overhead but never settled. Once I heard a distant crack, not of a branch snapping, but of something far below, something shifting underground, a sound like a sigh released after centuries of restraint. I reached a clearing I had not known existed. At its center lay a formation of stones arranged in a rough circle. They were too deliberate to be natural, too weathered to be recent. Lichen grew thick upon them, but beneath the green and gray, faint symbols had been carved. Some I recognized, ancient glyphs for wind, breath, memory. Others I did not, shapes that spiraled inward like collapsing galaxies. It struck me then what this place was, an observation circle, a site where monks long ago studied the earth not with instruments, but with attention, listening to its breaths and shifts, tracking its pulses as though taking the vital signs of a living being. I placed my hand on the nearest stone. It was warm, deeply, impossibly warm. Through that warmth came a sensation, not a vibration, not a hum, but something closer to emotion, a heaviness, a stirring, a silent plea. I pulled my hand back, but the feeling lingered, clinging to my skin like a memory. I sank to my knees in the clearing, wrestling with a fear that did not feel like my own. For a moment I could not distinguish where the earth ended and I began. It was as though the boundary had dissolved, as though the fracture between worlds had thinned to a veil. And then I realized, perhaps it had always been thin. We simply forgot how to feel through it. I spent hours in that clearing, tracing symbols, whispering half-formed questions into the air, listening for answers I could not yet articulate. When I finally returned to the monastery, I found a letter slipped under my door, written in a careful, elegant hand. There was no name, only a single line. "The memory of the earth is rising. Prepare yourself for the burden of knowing." My hands shook as I read it. Someone here understood far more than they had admitted. I opened the folio again, searching frantically for clues I might have missed, patterns invisible before the clearing had shown me how to listen. And I found them. Paragraphs that once seemed metaphorical now read like clinical descriptions. When the fractures converge, the Earth's pulse will steady into language. The atmosphere will distort as though straining to carry unspoken lament. The illusions of randomness will dissolve. Men will see patterns they once dismissed as noise. The ground beneath sanctuaries will awaken first, for truth seeks witness before it seeks judgment. My breath quickened. It was all there. Every tremor, every pulse, every distortion in the sky, every inexplicable warmth, every observation circle hidden beneath centuries of pine needles. None of it was random, none of it incidental. The earth was trying to communicate, Not with anger, with memory. A memory too vast to contain quietly anymore. I turned to the scribe's private pages, the ones that trembled with fear, the ones he never intended for public eyes. There I found the passage that completed the pattern. When the wane of stillness reaches its final phase, the fractures will not be merely geological. Minds will crack before mountains do. Hearts will quake before valleys split. For the covenant was written into flesh as much as into stone. I felt cold, not the cold of fear, the cold of recognition. Everything made sense now. The sleeplessness, the agitation in my chest, the whispering in the floor, the heaviness in the sky. The fracture was not only in the planet, it was in us. We were part of the same wounded system, reflections of the same imbalance. The prophecy was not about external catastrophe. It was about internal deterioration mirrored outward through the earth's own trembling, a shared unraveling, a mirrored collapse, a dialogue of wounds. And then, as though responding to my realization, the monastery trembled, not sharply, not dangerously, but with a long, low shudder, like a giant exhaling through clenched teeth. The oil lamp flickered violently. Dust drifted from the beams. The stone floor vibrated with a resonance that hummed through my jaw and spine. And in that trembling, I heard something. Not sound, meaning. A message too large to translate into human language, but clear enough to understand in essence. Remember what was forgotten, repair what was broken, witness what is coming. The tremor faded. Silence settled like ash. For a long time I sat there trembling myself, breath shallow, hands clenched, every part of me vibrating with the echo of that voiceless message. And in that moment, perhaps for the first time since finding the folio, I understood the true purpose of the prophecy. Not to warn of destruction, not to predict doom, not even to diagnose imbalance, but to prepare the mind for the moment when the earth and the human soul would finally tremble in unison, and the world would no longer allow us to pretend we were separate. I closed the folio gently, pressing my palm against its cover like sealing a wound. Tomorrow, I knew, the final part awaited. The revelation, the convergence, the moment when all the patterns would align, and I would be forced to face what the prophecy truly demanded of me, and of all of us. The final morning arrived like a held breath released too late. There was no sunrise, only a faint whitening of the sky, a dim spreading pallor, as though daylight no longer emerged from the sun but leaked out reluctantly from the wounded seams of the world. The monastery stones felt colder than usual beneath my feet, but the air around them thrummed with a quiet, unsettling life. Every corridor vibrated faintly, like the echo of a pulse running through colossal arteries buried deep beneath the mountain. I knew before opening my eyes that today would bring no new questions, only answers. And answers, I had learned, were heavier than doubt. I rose slowly, each movement feeling ceremonial, as though I were not dressing myself for the day, but preparing my body for something ancient and inevitable. The folio lay on my desk where I had left it, its pages faintly curled from the moisture in the air. The scribe's private writings rested beside it, the trembling strokes of his pen now mirrored by the trembling in my chest. I placed my hand on the folio. The stone beneath my feet shuddered gently, not violently, not like a threat, but like acknowledgement. It was time. I walked through the cloister toward the overlook outside the monastery walls, the ridge where my understanding had sharpened, where the world's pulse seemed closest to the surface. A dense mist crawled through the valley below, obscuring the villages, the rivers, the roads. Only the tops of pine trees pierced the fog, resembling dark islands rising from a pale, unsettled sea. The monks stood scattered along the edge, each silent, each staring into the trembling whiteness as though awaiting a verdict. No bell had summoned them, yet they gathered. I sensed they had been waiting for this day for longer than I had been alive, perhaps longer than this monastery had stood. One of them approached me. the thin monk with the trembling hand. Today he looked steadier than I had ever seen him. "You have heard what the world is saying," he murmured. "Now you must understand what it means." "What does it want?" I asked. But even as the question escaped my lips, I knew it was incomplete. Earth is not something that wants as we do. It does not desire. It remembers, it responds, it rebalances. He shook his head gently. "It is not a demand, it is a revelation." Behind him, the monastery stones shuddered again, slow, deep, resonant. Not a quake, a heartbeat. I sat at the edge of the overlook, opening the folio one last time. Its pages fluttered in the chilled air like living things, as though the manuscript itself had been waiting to breathe fully, only at this final moment. The light caught the ink in a strange way, illuminating certain lines more sharply than others, drawing my eye toward sections I had never noticed. The final page. The conclusion the scribe had hidden beneath layers of metaphor and caution. The truth he had feared to write plainly, yet could not withhold. It read, "When the fractures converge, the world shall reveal that it has never been separate from the souls that walk upon it. The trembling of the earth is the trembling of humanity. The sorrow of nations is the sorrow of the ground. The covenant was mutual, and its breaking has been mutual. The remedy must be the same." The remedy. A word I had not dared to hope for. The page continued. "In the final hour of the wane of stillness, the world will cry out not in fury but in the pain of labor. For it does not seek our end, it seeks our restoration. Restoration, not destruction." A wave of warmth passed through me, not comfort but understanding. Like a door opening inward, like a light revealing a room that had always existed behind my thoughts. The tremors, the pulses, the wandering winds, the bruised skies. These were not signs of apocalypse. They were signals of a world trying to correct itself, trying to birth equilibrium out of imbalance, trying to draw humanity back into harmony through the only language it had left. Every tremor was a plea. Every storm was a question. Every distorted sky was a mirror. The earth was not breaking. It was calling, and we had mistaken its call for collapse. My breath trembled as I lifted my gaze from the manuscript. The world around me shimmered, not visibly, not as light, but as sensation, as recognition. I felt it in my bones first, a slow, rhythmic pressure, as though the ground was sinking with the beat of my heart. Then, in the air, a soft pulse, like breath brushing against my skin. Then deeper, in the marrow of my thoughts, the place where doubt had once lived. It was all connected. Every clue, every tremor, every moment of my disbelief dissolving into uneasy truth. There was no boundary between the planet's restlessness and my own. No division between its grief and the grief I carried without words. For the first time, I understood the prophecy not as warning, but as revelation. The earth trembles because humanity trembles. We have fractured ourselves. And the world, bound to us by ancient covenant, fractures in answer. The solution was not written in the folio. It could never be written in a single book. Because the answer was not intellectual, it was relational. A healing not through knowledge, but through recognition. A rebalancing of the human heart so the world could rest again. The wind shifted suddenly, warm against my face. Not natural, not seasonal. A breath. A pulse rose beneath the mountain, steady, strong, deliberate. The monks bowed their heads. And in that resonance, I heard, not with ears, but with something older, the final message of the prophecy. The world remembers you. Remember it. A message not of fear, not of doom, but of shared responsibility, shared existence, shared wound, and shared healing. The trembling eased, the air grew calm, the sky lost its bruise. For a moment, a single, fragile moment, the world felt still again, as if offering us one last chance to listen, to understand, to repair. I closed the folio gently. The final page fluttered once, like an exhale. I stood, feeling the weight of the prophecy settle into me not as dread, but as purpose. A purpose I had not sought, yet could not refuse. The world had spoken. The fractures had converged. The truth was no longer hidden in the margins of forgotten manuscripts. It was alive, humming beneath the soles of our feet. I turned back toward the monastery, carrying with me the realization that had changed everything. The planet is restless and broken because we are restless and broken. Its healing begins with ours, its stillness with our stillness, its restoration with our repentance. The wind rose once more, gentle, steady, almost grateful.